Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the threshing process, and then Jared's going to continue with kind of an overview of seed cleaning and storage. And then we'll take a break around 3:30, and our last session we're going to go through the crops, some crop examples, then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for some varietal improvement techniques and practices. Okay. All right. So going back to the threshing here, and just to review that, really the idea of the threshing is to get rid of all that most 90% of the chaff and sticks and extraneous material is going to get removed through threshing. So at a small scale, hand threshing is sufficient. And when you're getting into it, that's what I would suggest. Start small, get used to what the whole process is. And before you start thinking about investing in lots of mechanical equipment, see what you can do by hand, and you'd probably surprise yourself what you actually could accomplish with hand equipment. Tarps, Rubbermaid totes, box fans, and homemade screens. The precision screens that we mentioned out there, we will have at the end. We'll be able to give you a couple of sources where to buy those precision screens. So if any of you are interested in that, come up here at the end. Okay, and this was my screen that I had outside, that homemade 3x3 screen just made from hardware cloth that you can get at the local hardware store. And it's great because it's large enough that you can run quite a bit of material through there in a relatively small amount of time. So this is the rough scalping stage, basically. So all those stems and all those pods, that's compost. And all your onion seed, in this case, is fallen through to the bin below. Now, if you get kind of the next scale up, and was that okay, so did everybody get to see that belt thresher out there? Okay. Yeah, this is a little larger unit here. But it's basically, the belt thresher is those two belts that are running opposite of one another, and it really takes the place of, obviously in bigger volumes, you don't want to be pushing everything with your hands. Even with a pair of gloves, you wear gloves out in a hurry and get awful tired. So at the next scale, you've got a belt thresher, and I don't know, we're probably talking about, I don't know what a used belt thresher would be. Maybe you guys know, but we're probably talking about, for a new one, is probably going to run you at least $15,000. And Jared,
that would be 25. That
would be 25. Okay. See, that's how much I'm out of it, because I remember 10 years ago they were like, they've gone up.
And you can't find. It's so hard to find a used one.
Yeah, that's the issue with like a belt thresher. Now, old combines is a different story. You might be able to find some of these old beaters for a few $100. But this. So at this scale, this is something that should probably be cooperatively owned. With a seed co-op, unless you are really doing more major volumes and you can actually afford to invest in that. And really, when you're talking about mechanical equipment, you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on, and get fancier and fancier. But you have to be able to justify it by the amount of seed that you're actually selling. Okay, at the next scale, thank you, Patty, for this, and Patty and Nash and Squim, Washington. This is on their farm. Windrowing, I think is a brassica crop. I'm not sure, but so when I talked about, I showed earlier that when I was holding that broccoli plant ready to harvest, So and I was doing those, cutting them by hand because I had a small plot. Well, at this scale, you probably want a cutter bar to go through to be able to windrow it. And then you allow the material to dry in the field for a few more days. And then you come and pick it up with a combine. And a combine really is a combination of threshing, breaking it off, breaking the seed away from the sticks and trash, and then running it through screens. So it's got a set of screens inside the machine. Okay, the reason for having landscape cloth, most of it is like something like the lettuce that I mentioned earlier, where you've got an issue with shattering. You're actually going to lose a lot of seed. You're going to lose it up to the ground. You don't normally, unless it's really damp, I mean, the landscape cloth isn't necessarily to keep it drier on the ground. I mean, it's, but if it does actually help you keep it drier by having it on the ground landscape cloth, and then you want a combine, then you actually have to you have to pull the landscape cloth away, but be able to retain a reasonable windrow that then you can pick it up with the combine. Normally we don't bother, yeah.
But I would say, I mean, most people who are going to pick up a windrow with a combine, they're on a big enough scale where it's not going to be realistic or feasible to put it on a tarp. So if it already fits on a tarp, you don't need to pick it up with a combine like that. You could just, you could probably hand feed it into the combine just as quickly as anything else. I mean, you could pour it off, but, the whole idea of those combines was that, you could do acres, and you're not going to put acres of a crop on a tarp, so.
And at that scale, you're less worried about the amount of seed you're just losing from it being in a windrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. And there are actually stationary combines that you could take your seed to it, like actually have it on landscape cloth, then carry it to the stationary combine and, as I say, feed the beast, and not have, the advantage of this is that you can cover a lot more ground. But it's at a certain scale, sort of that in-between scale, a stationary combine could work just fine. So, and then this is on the inside of an all-crop combine, and that was the go-to combine in the 50s and 60s before these modern combines. I mean, it did all-crop. It had screens for just about every crop you could think of. And what it is here, you see, there's like two scalping screens. Like on the top, this top screen right here is larger holes. So the largest hole. So the combine is like threshing this thing inside the guts. It's just rubbing with rollers or bars, and so it's breaking it away from all the sticks and plant material. And then it comes into this chamber, and it drops through that first scalping screen, and then eliminates all that big trash. Then there's a middle screen here, which also basically is a scalper. But it's smaller holes. So it's, and it works better when you've eliminated the first bunch of trash. So now there's less trash for it to deal with. And then, then the seed falls through down to here, and then, so you get this next bunch of, the next largest size of trash gets eliminated. And then on the bottom, you've got a very small screen that's smaller than your seed. And that eliminates dust and small weed seed and everything. So your seed, your good seed, is right in here, like this. And then that gets taken to another compartment in the combine. So that's the basic, and we do this as we're showing out there with the hand screens. It's the same basic, same basic principle.
You guys mind if I talk about threshing?
Yes,
Yes,
please
absolutely.
do.
So I just wanted to share with you guys a few options between using your hands and having a belt thresher are a great way to do it. Stepping on it is usually a little more body friendly than rubbing it with your hands. This one you didn't hear from me. But what I do with lettuce is I use my rototiller on my tractor. I flip up the safety guard. I put my, she's shaking her head already. I put the tractor on idle. So my tines are moving very slowly. And then I hold the lettuce plants just up to the tines. You know, and it's just beating them. You know, I got a tarp underneath. But it works great, you know, because I'm getting all the seed knocked off. I'm not getting too much chaff, you know, I'm not like just crushing that whole thing through the combine. You know, I'm not having to like work super hard with, you know, my hundreds of lettuce plants. You know, all I have to do is just hold it there for a second and then throw it away, hold it there for a second, throw it away. So, you know, you don't want to get sucked into the rototiller. That's why it's at idle. That's why you're careful. Yep, they volunteer to help. So, yeah, so this is kind of how you would set it up. You know, you've got your long piece of landscape fabric, and then, so then, you know, what you would want to do is you'd want to, you know, you can see all the base of the plants are here, sticking to the outside, with the heads of the crop more in the middle, and then the other side is, you know, the reverse. And then, you know, I just kind of like drive down the tarp and then move over 6 inches, drive back, move over 6 inches, you know, do that a couple times. And you just do that until, you know, when you get down and you're looking in here, you're seeing that all the pods are open. You know, you can overdo it and then you start crushing all the stems, and then you've got a bigger job for your, you know, initial scalping. So you want to do it just enough where, you know, then it's easy to just pull all the stems out and you've just got, like, you know, the pods and the seed to deal with.
We talked now about threshing, so being able to break the seeds from the rest of the plant material. And that's going to be your first step in this cleaning process. I'm going to walk through some of these other processes, some of the other steps. First, we're generally, when we think about seed cleaning, we're often talking about dry seed cleaning, but there are many wet seeded crops and they require a whole different process, and we'll run through that. But initially, and I don't think I have any pretty pictures for this, but initially what we're thinking about right after threshing, maybe I'll take this moment too to stand on my soapbox about some of these things. There's actually a decent amount of cleaning that happens before harvest, really. And so, you know, some of the things that are going to be the hardest for you to get out of your seed is not necessarily going to be the stems or the leaves or of the plant itself. It's going to be things like weed seed or, you know, dirt and stones. And these things you can do a good job of avoiding getting mixed in with your seed in order to save yourself a lot of trouble on the other end. And so some of the strategies to avoid that is, you know, first off, you often have more challenges as you get to a larger scale because it's easier, you know, when you're like that picture where you're picking up everything in your combine. It's going to be easier to end up with some dirt clods still stuck to roots depending on how you uprooted those plants. It's easier to have some weeds tangled in amongst your seed crop. And so especially when you're on that large scale, it usually helps to, prior to harvest, go through, walk your field and pull out if you've got weeds in there. I mean, if you're doing a good job in keeping a clean field the whole time, that's great. But if you've got weeds in there that are going to seed, pull those out ahead of time before you harvest. It's going to be a lot easier to pull, you know, remove seed from your, you know, weed seed from your lot when it's a plant at a time versus, you know, these little tiny seeds that are the same density and, you know, similar size as the seeds you want. Likewise, if you are windrowing your plants, you know, either cutting them rather than uprooting them to avoid getting dirt in there, and then some of those examples where people are putting on tarps, if you're keeping the seed heads into the middle and keeping the bases of the plants off your tarps off to the side, that's going to help remove dirt or reduce the amount of dirt that gets in there. I know that A good strategy is also just keeping your lots, keeping your steps of your seed cleaning separate along the way. So like when we talk about this idea of, Steve had mentioned about windrowing your lettuce onto some landscape fabric. This seed that falls on the tarp, in general, that's going to be seed that is, the stuff that's on the tarp, that's fallen off on the tarp, and just the other material that's on the tarp, that's going to be more likely where you're going to end up with some weed seeds, with some dirt and material in there. So rather than just treating everything as one big lot of seed in your cleaning process, if you, take your, when you take your plants off to thresh them, all that material that's on the tarp, you put that and you treat that as a separate lot for the process of cleaning. Because if it's got, any kind of dirt or weed seed in there, then you're just dealing with that smaller quantity instead of mixing it in with everything and then trying to pull it back out again later. So that's a good strategy for, ahead of time, basically making your life easier when you're cleaning. So next step is really one of the big processes of cleaning is really this concept of just volume reduction. Each step of the way you want to be reducing volume, you want to be removing more and more of the non-seed material in the easiest possible way. So what Steve had mentioned and Sebastian mentioned is sort of this idea of scalping, typically just trying to not necessarily get things in any way, shape, or form close to final cleaning, but just removing as much of the large sticks out of the way as early as possible, potentially out there in the field. So I think we have that picture of, that was Wild Garden Seed, Hank driving his truck over those brassica seeds. The next step that they would do after that, like Sebastian said, is you just be pulling all of the plants, after they've been threshed, taking them off the tarp. So you've already removed a whole bunch of volume right there, and then they'll just take that the material that's on the tarp, and they'll just throw it through like some nursery flats, some slatted nursery, black slatted nursery flats, and just pour that through quickly. Again, just keeping some of the biggest pieces of pod and stick out of the way. So that way, before they ever leave the field, before they're having to transport material to somewhere where it's going to actually be going through a more intensive seed cleaning process, they've already reduced their volume, 90%. So those are sort of pre-cleaning steps that are going to make your life easier. You all already saw a lot of this outside, so I'm going to keep it brief, but I'll just to make sure that the concepts are sunk in for everyone. When we're talking about cleaning dry-seeded crops, we're typically looking at these two processes for separating seed from non-seed material. We're looking at using wind to separate based on density. The non-seed material tends to be lighter than the seed material. So some tricks when you're thinking about fanning here, some of the strategies around this is that the more precise you can be about your separation between what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of, the better. And so, for example, if you see here, there's two totes, and there's going to be a stream of seed pouring down. And the goal is you want to get that stream of seed as close to the edge of that tote as you can, so that as much of the material that's light is blowing off as possible. So some strategies there. This is a couple of strategies, again, just on a small scale for being able to increase your precision. First is, actually with these box fans, you tend to get a more consistent, even airflow by having the fan sucking in rather than blowing out. So this is, again, over Wild Garden Seed, they were using basically just putting a box around the intake of these box fans with the idea of, wind getting pulled in tends to be getting pulled in all in the same, basically same direction, about the same speed, whereas when it's coming out, it's kind of coming out in this more turbulent fashion. And because it's turbulent, it means that it's more likely that you might have a little bit of seed blowing a little too far, a little too close, and all of a sudden you have to back up a little further into your bucket, and you end up with more non-seed material each pass that you do. So pulling in, the second thing you notice here is they're using a square-sided container and pouring a relatively thin sheet of seed out at a time. The idea here is that each one of these individual seeds is sort of experiencing about the same amount of wind pulling it in towards the fan. And that way, again, you can get this nice clean sheet that's going to go right up to the edge of that tote. Whereas if you got the round-sided, what you might end up with is and if you pour too quickly, you start to get clumps, and those clumps fall unevenly. So again, the more precise you can be with the consistency of your wind and how you're pouring your seed, the closer you can get to the edge and the fewer passes of fanning that you'd need to be making. Another strategy that I'm going to mention in a second is what really you want to do is you want to end up incorporating this with the other step. So the other step in general is going to be screening. So this is where you're separating out your seed from your non-seed material based on the idea that in general seeds are going to be relatively consistent in size, and you can figure out what size of screen either lets your seed pass through and keeps the non-seed material on top, or keeps your seed on top and lets the non-seed material fall through. In an ideal world, your seeds are going to all be at the same size, but with some seed crops, something like beets, for example, they can have a range of sizes, on a given plant. And what that means is it makes it tricky for, trickier for fanning, because now you've got, seeds that are more dense and less dense that are more likely to catch the air and not catch the air. And so a lot of times what you'll see is that after, say, a rough scalping, you might do a screening, and you'll use your screens to not just separate out material that's larger from the seeds and material that's smaller from the seeds, but actually separate the seeds into different grades of sizes. So you'll have your large seeds in a separate pile from your medium seeds and a separate pile from your small seeds. And then you can clean each of those lots individually, and because they're more consistent in size, they're going to be more amenable to being separated with your fanning. So both, when we're talking about the fanning and winnowing, a lot of times this gets combined together into something like the air screen cleaner, the clipper, the Crippen that you saw outside, like Michaela probably mentioned, they come in lots of different sizes. With all of this material, I just want to point out something that's really important to think about is that it's not just about, boy, if I could only get enough money to buy the bigger equipment, it's going to benefit me. A lot of times, you're actually, based on the scale of the crops that you're working with, you're going to be better off not having equipment. And what I mean by that is this: there's the time spent cleaning the seed. So putting the seed in your air screen cleaner and it coming out through, that's a certain length of time. And then there's the time spent cleaning the equipment. And the cleaning the equipment time can be very long. The bigger the piece of equipment, the more nooks and crannies exist within it, and the more time you're going to be spending crawling around with an air compressor trying to get those seeds out of all those nooks and crannies, because it's really easy to contaminate between your seed lots when you have pieces of equipment like this. And so if you're growing 20 different varieties of lettuce, and each of those may take you 10 minutes to run through an air screen cleaner, but if it takes you an hour to clean that thing out between lots, then you may be better off just doing it like this, because here you've got a lot less places that you have to, a lot less effort to clean a bucket and a couple of totes and a fan. So that your cleaning time is basically close to zero here. And so that's something to consider with all these things. Likewise with the combines. Combines can take forever to clean out between lots. If you're just growing a single crop of a single variety and it's on, you know, a large acreage, then that's when it really pays off to have that kind of big equipment. Yeah?
Can you talk about why there's 2 fans?
Yeah. So why is he using 2 fans? Basically, the idea there is that there are times when you want to have the airflow higher and times when you want to have the airflow lower. And the reason he has 2 fans back to back there is he basically can have, instead of 3 settings, he can have 6 settings. So that was the reasoning there. The more the merrier. There's we're going to have a talk. Let me see. I forget what day it is, but there's a equipment innovations talk, and there's some really good examples of people setting up. There's one that I saw that was called the Winnow Wizard, and it was basically a fan setup, but with all sorts of infinite adjustability in terms of the distance between, you know, where the seed is being dropped and the fan, in terms of the fan speed, in terms of sort of the tilt and direction of the wind. So being able to adjust things more, and then keeping track of what your adjustments are. Having a good seed cleaning notebook is really helpful. So knowing, you know, okay, I use this fan setting and I had it this distance away. I used this screen to scalp. I used this screen to, for my top screen. I separated it into these different, sizes of seed, and then came back and fanned it again. Making those notes is going to make your life a lot easier next year, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every year. So know that a lot of times what you're looking at is it's an iterative process. You're going to repeat this. You're gonna fan, and you're gonna winnow, and you're gonna winnow, and you're gonna fan, and you're gonna screen, and each time you're gonna approach a little bit closer. One of the advantages of being a human as opposed to a piece of equipment is when you are using hand screens, you have the ability to stop earlier. You can put a small layer of seed on, you can shake it a little bit, and you can see how much of your seed has fallen through and what's on top. And you can stop shaking then and keep, the material on top to stay on top. A lot of times if you keep shaking, everything's going to fall through. So you have this knowing when to stop is really an important thing to pay attention to. Another thing to think about in this whole process is, one of the reasons that we spend this time talking about seed cleaning is I know for a lot of growers, this is when they start to lose money. They've gone through the process of growing the crop, and they've got the crop harvested, it's sitting in totes like that out there, and they've gotten it 85% of the way clean. And getting it to fully clean can be a real time suck. And so knowing these strategies is really important. Also, knowing what is actually necessary for your market. I mean, if you're growing it for yourself, okay, well, how clean does it need to be able to go back in my cedar the next spring? If you're growing it on contract, there may be a point where it pays to send it not 100% clean. If you talk to the company you're contracting with, and they have the ability to finish it with some more expensive, better tools, and they might dock you for that, but it may be cheaper than, you may end up spending, to get from 95 to 100%, you may have spent, an equal amount of labor as you did to get it all the way up to that point. So, knowing when to just, knowing what the options are with the company you're contracting with, and if you can, send it 95% of the way there, that can make your life easier. If you're in the packet business, like Sebastian was talking about, and you're actually sending seed out to farmers or gardeners, then usually you got to get it 100% of the way there. You may be, hanging out with tweezers at some point, pulling individual things out. Hopefully you don't have to do that. There are a few other tools besides just screening and fanning. There's the gravity table here. So essentially, gravity table, it has a deck, and on this deck, air is blowing up and it's vibrating, and you can adjust the slants on it in 2 directions, and it can separate seed based on density, essentially. And these the gravity tables tend to be fairly expensive. They also require a certain volume of seed to fill the deck because it operates on, it sort of requires this volume to operate properly. This again is something that's generally you're going to see at a seed company, but if you're at a large enough scale, these can be wonderful, especially for getting you to that 100% clean or getting you to higher germ. So, you know, one of the challenges is sometimes you may have seed that's clean, but you want to be at 85% germ and you're only at 75% germ. Can you get there? Is this a loss of the crop? Gravity tables, you can separate out the least dense seed and it can bump your germ up. You can actually also do that with fanning to some extent. You can just begin fanning more aggressively, blowing off more of your light seed to try and get your germ up.
Jared?
Yeah.
Just a comment about gravity tables. Another thing that's very valuable with gravity tables, and another thing about gravity tables is that, maybe you can go to that picture, Jared. There's a hood up above, and it sucks. It's suction, and it's actually a vent that goes out, and it's a great way to eliminate all the dust in a lot. It's really effective, especially with large lots. It's like really effective. And the thing is, what's happening with the gravity table? It's shaking. It's sloped in two directions, and it's like a bed. The seed's riding on a bed of air. And so as it's shaking, the heavy seed migrates to the upper side and the lighter seed goes down, which is why you're able to separate it out. And I know that for large lots where you're dealing with a lot of trash, that say you're running them through a combine and there's a lot of dust and stuff, it's really nice to have a gravity table that'll handle those kinds of volumes.
Yep. I'll just throw in there, because you mentioned the hood thing. Thinking about seed cleaning in general, think about your health in all this. You know, I know a seed grower that said, you know, he switched from produce to seed, and he said, yeah, he basically switched from hurting his back to hurting his lungs. There's a lot of dust involved in seed cleaning, and you know, don't just try and cowboy through it. Think ahead of time about, you know, how you're managing that dust, whether you're going to be managing it with your own personal respirator or with some sort of hood, or operating, you know, outside as much as you can, because it's going to take its toll in the long term. And sometimes in the short term, there are definitely some seed crops that'll, you know, like barley. I've gotten a nosebleed after a day of cleaning barley. So, you know, some you'll notice right away, but, you know, over the long run, you want to minimize this dust inhalation. Other tools are kind of air column separators, things that are basically going to be able to push air up, and then you can, what it does is it'll push air up, and that will push, as seed that is more likely to catch the air will go higher, and you can kind of set how strong the air speed is, will allow you to kind of find this cutoff of where your chaff is blowing up higher, and you're able to then cut off your seed at a certain point. There's a lot of different designs for air separators that are out there that you can make yourself. There's some that look like this, some that are just more look like tubes. I think possibly there's going to be some in the Farmer Innovation Workshop, but I can send you some links to them. You can make them yourself out of, you know, PVC pipe or wood, and these are really nice for if you're really dealing with small lots of seed. If you're in the packet seed world and you want to get something final, clean, sometimes again it has this sort of infinite adjustability of how much strongly the air is blowing up. So those are some of the some of the tools that you're going to have for dry seeded crops. Now I want to briefly touch on wet seeded crops. There's a whole other world. So wet seeded crops, we're talking about things primarily in the Solanaceae, Cucurbitaceae, so tomatoes, cucumbers, squash. Peppers can be approached either as a dry seeded or a wet seeded crop to a certain extent. But basically, when we're talking about wet seeded crops, these are crops that you're going to be processing and cleaning with water. So first step is essentially threshing this seed crop. So in this case, if you're just pushing it through seed mesh, you could be putting these in a bucket. And Sarah and Andrew over at Adaptive Seed say their most common wet seeded processing tool, I think, is a 4x4 in a bucket, just smashing up tomatoes and peppers and things like that. You can be you can be splitting them and scooping seed. I've seen people processing watermelons, with a shop vac, scooping them out with a shop vac. There's lots of ways to get the seed out. So at that point, you've got seed and pulp all mixed together. And you've got, in the case of tomatoes and cucumbers, you have this gel surrounding them. So the next step for many crops is actually going to be a fermentation step. This is something that pretty much everyone does in the organic seed world, at least for cucumbers and tomatoes, because it does dissolve that gel. But many growers also do this fermentation step, although it's not necessary. Many growers also do this for other crops like winter squash. And the appeal with the fermentation step is it will dissolve that gel. What it can also dissolve is it will dissolve the pulp. It will dissolve, say, if you think about winter squash, you've got all this stringy placental tissue that's attached to the seed. It will dissolve that down and make it more of a goop instead of these strings that are strongly attached to the seeds. So when you're talking about fermentation, what you're looking for is adding, in the case of something like tomatoes, usually you're just starting with tomato pulp. When you're talking about something like winter squash, you're actually often adding a little bit of water to the mix, stirring it up, and then you're letting it ferment somewhere around 2 or 3 days in warm temperatures. This is going to vary depending on what your temperatures are, depending on what the seed crop is. Again, for something like the squashes, you're going to ferment less because your goal is it's just going to make your life easy cleaning. You're not actually trying to dissolve that gel sac. And you can go too far with this fermentation process, and you can actually start to eat into the seed coat and decrease your seed quality. So you are better erring on the not fermented enough side with the crops that don't really need it. After 2 or 3 days, your next step is generally going to be one of rinsing and decanting. So this basically means to say, you had your pulp and seed in this bucket all together. What you're going to now do is, after it's fermented, add additional water to the bucket, stir it around. In general, your heavy seeds are going to be sinking to the bottom of the bucket. Your pulp and light seed is at the top. So you're going to be pouring this out slowly. You're going to pour until you start to see the seeds at the bottom of the bucket. You'll stop and fill it up with water again and rinse it around, and then pour it off again until you start to see, get close to pouring the seeds off. Stop, add more water, rinse it around until all you've got left is seeds in clear, clean water. At that point, you can pour off the seeds into something like a screen here, and then spread it out to dry, because now you've got seeds that are just about ready to germinate on you. So you want to spread these out quickly, dry them, stir them while they're drying so they don't stick together. A slightly larger scale alternate technology here. This is a seed sluice. You can see these at various sizes and scales. This is something that's relatively decent size for a small, medium-sized grower here. So this basically works on the principle that you've got this long sloping box that has a series of slats at the bottom here. The seed will get caught behind those slats as it goes down. The pulp and light seed flows over the slats. See, this is a fairly water-intensive process. This is something that you're gonna, but it's also a lot faster than the rinse and decant method. Once all you have left is good seed that's behind those individual little slats there, then you can rinse it all down. Last thing I'm going to talk about here before the break is a little bit about seed storage. So what are the things that you want to think about when you're talking about seed storage? Key pieces here: you want as much as possible cool temperatures, low humidity. You prefer it to be dark. You'd like the temperatures to be as consistent as possible. Again, thinking about this seed is alive. It will continue to respire and use energy, and it's more likely to, it'll have an increased metabolism the higher the moisture level is, and the higher the temperatures are. And so that will decrease the vigor over time. In addition, as the humidity gets too high, you have the potential for diseases to be starting to get on your seeds, especially if you store your seed dirty. That's a good reason to get your seed clean right away, is because when you're storing your seed with chaff still in place, that chaff basically can act as this sponge that will have a little bit higher moisture level within it, and more likely to have some fungal spores in there. And so getting your seed clean before you're storing, seed is relatively resistant to attack from diseases and fungi at this point, because it's very dense and dry. So storing it in a place that has a minimum of fluctuations in terms of temperature and humidity. Rule of thumb that you often hear is this idea that if you took the relative humidity of your seed storage and you added it to the temperature in Fahrenheit, that those numbers together should be less than 100. So say 50% relative humidity, 50%.
50 degrees.
50 degrees, thank you. That being said, you actually don't want 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 10% humidity is not really ideal, and 10 degrees Fahrenheit and 90% humidity is also not really ideal. So more or less you'd rather like to keep those temperatures, below, on the 50 degrees approximately, maybe 40 to 50, and then, under 50% relative humidity. What are you doing if you live in a place that doesn't have that? Well, you can try and modify things in various ways. Do you live in a place that's dry but it's too hot? Well, then you can, install something like this, where you've got your kind of a root cellar, seed cellar type setup, where you're actually going into the ground to be able to minimize, lower your temperature and decrease the fluctuations. What if you live in a place that's cool but it's way too humid? Then what you can consider is having your seed stored in airtight containers, so that you can control the humidity within those containers, either by starting with very dry seed going in there, and or adding some desiccant, depending on the scale that you're working with. And then within each of those airtight containers, you've got the low relative humidity. Yeah, so this says airtight containers with desiccant. Yeah, exactly, because you've still got a little bit of airspace there, and every time you open up a container, you're adding more humid air into the top of it, and so that'll help absorb it. Yeah. So the risk. Yeah. So the advantage of airtight containers is that if you've got seed going in there that's already very dry, you can sort of maintain that within the jar. The minus of that is if you've got seed that's not very dry and you've got fluctuating temperatures, you can start to get condensation on the inside of the jar, and condensation is just bad news for seed. Likewise, so in the ideal situation, I think something like this, where these are all Steve's pictures, but this was in New Mexico, right?
Actually, that's Colorado.
Colorado.
It's similar.
Right. So this is in Colorado.
It's an insulated garage.
Yeah. And what's probably the relative humidity there?
Probably there it's about 25.
Yeah. So you've got an environment that's got really low relative humidity. They've got it in a space that's insulated from fluctuating temperatures, and then you can put it into things that are breathable. Yeah, so I mean, so that depends on the scale of what you're operating on, but you can buy desiccant in various quantities. They sell either stuff that's kind of more like kitty litter, silica. You'll see the more color indicating crystals. I do not think the color indicating ones are OMRI approved, however, so you want to just get the plain stuff. You can. So the advantage of that again is that it's capturing the if there's any ambient excess moisture there. Exactly, yeah. So if you had, say just a jar like this, you would have your, say a cotton bag that had the desiccant in there at the bottom, and then your seeds up above, and then it was within that jar. Yeah.
Can you think of anything that would be a natural material?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can just use rice or something that's
Kitty litter.
Yeah.
I use kitty litter, that non-scented kitty litter that I put in the bottom of Rubbermaid totes, although they're not really
airtight.
Not really airtight. But it ends up being a little bit drier. I can do a better job, but it does help.
Yeah. So the comment was that she both uses boxes that can be scaled to minimize the amount of airspace that's in there, but also using reusable desiccant. And a lot of the desiccant is reusable. I do the same thing. I use silica that you can basically tell when it starts to get moist. You can put it in the oven or the microwave. You can dry it out again and be able to continue to use it.
That maybe you mentioned before a little bit, making sure that when you put it in the jar, it's dry enough.
Oh, here we go. Here's what I was going to mention. Was right. So first off, yeah, I mean, the idea here is you want to be getting your seed very dry. So what Steve showed before when he was talking about infrastructure setup, you're going to, depending on where your climate is, after you've gotten your seed clean, either wet seed or dry seed, you're potentially going to want to be spreading it out one more time in a greenhouse on screens, getting it good and bone dry before it's going in for storage. Yeah, so the question was around screen material. I haven't ever had a problem with screen material affecting the quality of seeds. What I would say as far as light and heat, in general, you want to keep your seeds out of light if you can. Some seeds are going to be more sensitive to that. Some seeds are more sensitive to heat. I know we've got lettuce seed grower somewhere in here. Lettuce is a common, what you can have is, this, induced dormancy, essentially. If you're drying your seed in the heat and light, you can end up with seed that becomes dormant. So that's an issue. So in general, yeah, you'd like it to be, your perfect drying situation is one that is warm but not too warm, say somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees, has really good airflow and really good dry conditions, and is shaded from the light. So if you can get all those things together, and airflow, is happening both, through your structure, but also, thinking about within your seed. What you don't want to have is a big, like Steve said, you don't want to have a big pile of seed where it's still a little bit of moist, and in the middle of that pile, it's getting hot, and it's starting to, cook it and starting to, have all this moisture in there. You want to have it spread out thin. You want to be stirring it if you need to make sure that it's drying evenly. Yeah, so the question is, when do you know the seed is dry enough? It's a really good question. So some seed crops will, what I have for some seed crops, I actually have a grain moisture meter. Bought it for, it was like $50, and they actually, it only comes calibrated officially for grain crops, but I contacted the company, and they actually had spec sheets for all these vegetable seed crops too, so you can put it in there and you can get an actual, percent moisture on it, and that was great. If you don't have that, you can either you can use a sample of it and do like a microwave test where if you've got a good scale, you start by weighing the seed and on the scale, then you put it in the microwave, you microwave the heck out of it, you take it out, you weigh it again, and then you put it back in the microwave, and you keep on microwaving until the weight doesn't go down anymore, and you start with how much did it start, how much did it weigh when it started, how much did it weigh when it ended, and you can figure out the percent moisture that way. On a more... And
the percent moisture should be what?
Okay, so what's your goal percent moisture? Usually you're looking somewhere, under 12%, but it varies based on the crop. It varies based on what you can actually accomplish. I'm not going to claim that I know all of the NOP regulations here, but certainly in the conventional seed world, there's a number of storage products that are used to keep down fungus, keep away rodents, all of those, keep down storage pests like, little mites and grain borers and things like that. And pretty much all of those storage products are not allowed in organic seed production. Yes, the question is, what about freezing if you want to save seed for a long time? So the advantage of freezing, like you said, is freezing can actually preserve things for much longer than if you just have it at kind of cool conditions. But in order to freeze it, first off, what you have to do is you have to, like you said, you're going to have to get it down to even drier because you can risk decreasing the seed quality. You can risk basically rupturing some of the cells if you're freezing seed that's a little too moist. Secondly, what you have when you're freezing seed, and the reason that you'd only really want to consider it for longer term storage, is every time you bring seed out of a freezer, it's going to be cold. And so what you need to do is when you bring it out of the freezer, you've got to let it sit still in its airtight container until it comes all the way up to room temperature before you open up the bag, because otherwise, you've got cold seed, the moist air is going to condense on it. And so that's not a kind of situation. If you're in a packet seed business and you're wanting to grab, some containers to be packeting up an order, you're not going to want that in the freezer because you're going to be waiting a couple hours for it to come up to temperature every time you do it. So the thing that I finally remembered to mention. So one of the easy ways to kind of monitor your seed moisture. This is a trick from Frank Morton again at Wild Garden Seed. Is what he does is he uses what he calls this envelope test. So he just has say his seed is stored in a bunch of Rubbermaid totes, and what he'll have is he'll take an envelope and he'll an old-fashioned lick-to-seal type envelope, and he'll put it down lengthwise into the tote. And then when he's getting seed out of there, he'll check the envelope, and he'll check. Basically, it has three settings. The first is the envelope, when he shakes it, it's still got a nice crinkly, crispy sound to it. And that's what you want. Second setting is, it sounds a little moist. It's not quite as crispy sounding when you shake the paper. And then the third setting is that the actual, lick the seal part is stuck and it's gotten sticky, and that means that the stuff is definitely too wet and you should take it out and re-dry it. So that's kind of a real low-tech seed storage monitoring system. Well, if it's really too moist, then you've got the potential of condensation forming. You've got the potential of mold happening in your seeds. But if we're not at that level, then really what you're looking at is just a shortened lifespan. So if this is less of an issue if this is either A, you're just storing this in time to ship it to the seed company, or B, you're storing this for next year's planting. But if you're talking about storing this for a few years, then it starts to become more and more important. And different seed crops have different expected lifespans, regardless of whether their moisture. You also have the secondary factor, which is that some seed crops just lose their vigor and germination more rapidly than others. And there's some good tables, I think, in both of those books that break down kind of a range of expected, life expectancy for your seeds.